Emitting new data is arguably the most important thing observables do. And in, I'd say, 99% of all cases, when you subscribe, you'll pass that first argument where you're interested in the data you're getting. Or maybe it's 90%, because there is one other important use case too, especially when we think about things like HTTP requests, and that is error handling. This counter here can't fail. There is no error that could occur here. But that's a different story if you're sending HTTP requests, which we will later do. So here, of course, we can also fake an error. We can simply throw one and define our own condition when we want to do that. Now, to do that, we could, for example, check if count is greater than 3. So if that occurs, then we'll, first of all, still emit that new data with the next method, but then we'll also use the error method to throw a new error here. So here I'll create a new error object, count is greater 3, which of course is a horrible event that definitely is worth an error. Now, if we do that and I save everything, let's see what happens. It starts counting again. And as soon as we exceed 3, we get an error here, right? We get our error that we defined. And you see that the observable now stops emitting. It actually gives us 4, which makes sense because that's the last value it emits before this condition is true. But there are no other values emitted. Because whenever an observable throws an error, it cancels, it's done. It will not emit any other values. It dies, so to say. And therefore, in that case, you also don't need to unsubscribe. You still can unsubscribe if you navigate away. You'll not get an error, but it's not necessary because, well, it was dead anyways. But you might not have known that when you unsubscribed, so unsubscribing is not an issue. Now, this is how you can throw your own errors. And of course, it's more important to not just throw them. That most of the time will be done for you when you're using some built-in Angular functionality that can fail, like HTTP requests. But it's important to know how to handle that. And for that, you can pass another argument to subscribe. Thus far, we passed the first argument, which is this data function. The second argument would be our function that gets called when an error occurs. And we'll get the error as an argument there. Now, of course, the simplest thing we can do here is that we log that error to the console. But obviously, you could do way more than that. You could send it to your own backend and store it in a database there. You can show an error message, an alert to the user. Let's actually do that. Let's show an alert. And let's show the error message here in the alert. So that's what we're doing here. We're logging it to the console. We're showing an alert. And now it starts counting again. And as soon as we exceed 3, here you go. Now we get our alert. And you see we don't have that red error here on the right anymore. Instead, it's now a regular console log because that's what we're doing. So now we're handling that error. And that, of course, is also an important part. Now, handling errors is nice, but what about completing the observable? I told you that throwing an error actually cancels the observable and lets it die, but completing it is something different. Completing can be a normal process in an observable. Now, our interval by default doesn't complete. It will emit new values until the end of time. An HTTP request, on the other hand, will complete. It completes whenever a response by the server is there. And of course, here, when we're building our own observable from the ground up, we can also complete this manually. In the end, we are defining how our observable behaves. Our event source is the set interval we have wrapped in our observable. And therefore, before we throw an error, let's say, we can also add another condition, say, if count is equal to 2, well, then we simply call observer complete. And there, you don't need to pass any arguments. Now, when you call complete, the observable will really come to a halt. And you can see that if you now reload, it logs 0, it logs 1, it logs 2, and that's it. Doesn't log anything else, doesn't reach our error condition because we complete the observable before it gets there. And that is important to understand and to keep in mind. Whenever an observable completes, it really is done. There are no other values emitted thereafter, which kind of makes sense because, well, it completed. Now, if you want to react to that completion, you can add a third argument to the subscribe method, and that is your completion handler function. It's a function that gets no arguments, because completing doesn't pass any arguments, and it's simply a function where you can do some cleanup work or whatever you need to do. And here I'll just log completed. Also important, you don't need to unsubscribe if your observable did complete, but again, you might not know that here in ng-on-destroy, so you can still do that without getting errors. So if I reload now, we see our logs again, and after the 2, we see completed. Now, also worth noting though, and important to keep in mind, you might think that complete, so that complete function here, also fires when you're getting an error. After all, the observable does finish after throwing an error, right? Well, that's not the case. If we change the complete condition here temporarily to, let's say, 4, and therefore this to 5, let's say, and therefore this will happen after this condition, which actually will throw an error, you will see something that might surprise you. We see our normal output here, and then we get that error, and that's it. What you don't see anywhere is our completed log. So this here never gets logged. And that's just one important characteristic you have to keep in mind about observables. When it cancels due to an error, then that's a different thing than when it completes. An error cancels the observable, it does not complete it. Technically, in both cases, no new values are emitted, but regarding the functions that get called here, there is a difference. That was a lot of talking about observables. But now we have an example of an observable and how it behaves under the hood. However, I know that this can look even more confusing, and you might ask yourself, well, when do I write this code? Because that's nice about the interval, but come on, I don't need that interval that often in my application. And you would be right, and by the way, if you needed one, you'd of course use the built-in interval function and not build your own one. So what's the idea behind that example? The idea is that you understand what happens inside of an observable. Whenever you subscribe and you set up your different handler functions here, RxJS in the end merges them all together into one object and passes that object, the observer, to the observable. And inside of the observable, it will then interact with the observer and let the observer know about new data and errors and so on. And that is how your functions get called. However, you rarely, very, very, very rarely build your own observables. More often, you use observables that come with libraries like Angular, like the route params observable we already used. Under the hood, that in the end is a custom observable built by the Angular team, but of course you just use it like that. You rarely build your own ones, but still, it's super important to understand how they work under the hood. And in the end, they all work a bit like that. They wrap some event source. In this case, it's setInterval. In other cases, it could be an AJAX request or a click listener or whatever it is. And they give you data or possibly also errors or the complete event. And you will mostly use subscribe and pass in functions that deal with that data or those errors.